Well, good evening and welcome everyone to Night 5 of Plenary Tracker, bringing you news and insights from the Plenary Council from the Australasian Catholic Coalition for Church Reform and Concerned Catholics Canberra-Goulburn. My name's Genevieve Jacobs. It's good to be with you again from the lands of the Ngunnawal people, whose elders and traditional ownership I acknowledge, and the elders of the places from whence you join us. This event has been designed to prompt conversations, to kickstart debates and provide some transparency over council proceedings. Please post your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen through our moderator, Danielle, tonight. And please, let's have respectful engagement. Let's ask questions that truly take us somewhere useful. Be robust, be critical, but ask something meaningful. James is our technical administrator. You can message him through the Q&A screen if you're experiencing any difficulties. Tonight, a discussion on the church in the public sphere and how it could and should be responding to major contemporary issues in Australia. But first, news from the Plenary Council. The plenary's virtual deliberations went behind closed doors today as the delegates discussed the scandal of sexual abuse. In his blog, Francis Sullivan says that it was very powerful. The atmosphere was solemn, the burden far from light. The former head of the Church's Truth, Justice and Healing Council, Francis, says the processes of accounting and safeguarding are light years better today than previous times, but he writes, the Church still effectively investigates itself in meeting safeguarding standards and addressing initial complaints. He says, the voices of the victims seem absent from the governance structures charged with dealing with abuse cases. John Warhurst, in his blog, says the broader society still wants to hear, above all, from the bishops, if and when the Plenary Council issues a public statement regarding its deliberations today. And the Plenary Press Office says there will be no statement today. Let's go now to our first guest this evening. Our Plenary Council member today is Dr. Nimi Kandapa, a Melbourne writer and academic who has a deep interest in bringing faith into our everyday lives. Nimmi, good evening. Today, as we've heard, a very sober one in many ways. Francis Sullivan writes in his blog, unless all the implications of the sex abuse scandal are faced head on, I fear the Church will struggle to be identified for anything else in my lifetime. Can you tell me how hard today was for you as a Plenary Council delegate?
Sure. Thank you, Genevieve. Begin today firstly by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land I am on today and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Look, today was difficult. I think anytime we sit with the pain of others and the pain that we might feel, it's a difficult thing to process, and I think it can weigh heavily on us. I found it very helpful. I think the people who organised the presentations did it sensitively, compassionately, and it really touched a deep place in me, because I feel as though, well, yes, as Francis says, and as we know, unless we really acknowledge that sincerely, without any excuses, it is really difficult to move forward with it. And with any relationship, I think this is the first step, and I think it was done well.
As we heard, the session was closed. I just wonder if you could share the intentions there so that we all understand why that took place.
The intention of the session?
The intention of the session being closed.
Oh, sure. Well, as you can imagine, it's just such a sensitive, painful place, and we were encouraged to really be open with each other and to allow our feelings to show and to express ourselves. And it was, you know, in not only this context, but in many ways in which we have felt excluded. So I think personal stories were so poignant that we didn't want to, I guess, risk people feeling that their stories might get out, or that they will be left feeling vulnerable.
Yeah, and I understand also there's an intention that the stories themselves are traumatic, and so they're very personal, they're very private. People show great courage in sharing them and being open with them for the good of this journey that the Church is on. And so there's no wish to cause further trauma through that process for people who are watching or perhaps participating.
Yeah.
Nimi, it may not feature prominently on the formal agenda, but what we hear of the council itself indicates that the role of women in the church is a major issue. Now, of course, our focus tonight is the church in the public sphere. In the era of Australia's first woman Prime Minister, of vigorous debate about women's equality in decision-making, of real anger about leadership structures, for example, it's not really an optional discussion any longer, is it? That women's role in the church needs profound examination.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, I guess the Plenary Council for me predominantly is a question about how do we lead people to a closer relationship with God. I think that's really the foundation for me. And in terms of women and women's involvement, I think this is a key area in which we are missing the contribution of women and women's faith. You know, for me, you know, I'm a strong Catholic. I love the church. I get a lot from it, and I get a lot from the sacraments. But being at Mass and hearing, say, the male interpretation of the gospel every week, I find that has restricted, I guess, the width or the depth of my faith, and I seek a lot of wisdom from women I know, and learn from their interpretations of the faith, and in that sense, I guess, I think it's crucial. I think it's crucial to have more women's involvement in all the different areas.
I think you've explained that beautifully, because the point that you're making is that when we have only one gender lens, there's a huge section with their own specific experiences, their own specific responses, the things that are born out of being a woman that are simply not addressed by the current processes. So this is not just a matter of it's not fair, it's you don't always speak to us.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's a distinction that has to be made. I understand, and you know, I relate to this view as well, that, you know, it just makes sense to have women as part of the governance. But from a church point of view, I don't think they come from it from that point of view. There's a spiritual dimension to all of this, and so there's argument that can be used to say, well, that's not what God wants, or that's not how it is, and so I can understand that aspect as well. But for me, it's all about, would it help people grow deeper in faith? And I really think it will. And I think if that's the case, and Pope John Paul II talks about the genius of women, I think that if the church genuinely believes that, then we would need to find a way of incorporating women's faith and women's experiences into the church.
And look, we spent some time last night discussing governance, and this comes into those questions as well. I remember Monsignor Tony Ireland, who's becoming a bishop, saying to me years ago that a great deal of the church's crises would be ameliorated by getting everyone above the level of parish priest to get company director qualifications. And, you know, his point was, when we discuss governance in the corporate and not-for-profit worlds, shareholders expect standards to be upheld. Companies are judged on their adherence to those standards. How much does governance matter for the church's credibility in the public sphere and diverse participation in that governance?
Yeah, I think we're coming to that understanding that the priestly hierarchy are not necessarily qualified to run such a big institution. In terms of training, you know, they have wonderful faith and they have wonderful intentions, but I think that the training to lead and to manage is something that is quite often lacking in the priestly formation. And yeah, hopefully that, being aware of it, we can grow in this area.
And the significance there is that if we present ourselves as a credible institution to the world, if the church's weight and majesty, the depth and richness of its knowledge is to be represented in a way that's useful to the community, we ought to do so from a perspective of being representative, of being able to speak for all those within the fold. And that simply seems unbalanced as things are at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, again, often in the conversation, we hear the point, the church is not a democracy. And we're sort of reminded that the church operates differently to secular organizations, and I can relate to that as well. I think we're not simply here to justify ourselves to the secular world. We have the right, I think, to operate differently, but I think we always have to question, is it working for us? Are people being able to relate to what we're presenting to them? And I think, like, for example, if I watch the Vatican Mass, I feel excluded. I'm a staunch Catholic, but I see the sea of white, well, not necessarily white, but just men there, and I feel as though I'm not part of it. So I think visually being able to recognize ourselves in the church hierarchy and church governance is important.
Nimmi, some of the things we've been discussing thus far have been quite vigorous action items about governance and representation and so on and so forth. But I know that you're also concerned about the need for a more contemplative approach to building relationships with God. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, I think so. For me, as I said, this is, I'm hopeful that this will lead more people to God and a deeper relationship with God. And I find that in one sense, we are not like secular organizations and the secular world in terms of how we govern, but in another sense, we can be quite busy in how we pray and how we do church, I think. And the ability to sort of go inside ourselves, be contemplative, seek God inside of us, I think then really centers us and allows us to feel the presence of God, which then transforms our actions and our awareness of God and converts our prayer. So I really think that I'm hoping that the group that's looking at the contemplative side of things will look at how we can be still and reflect more.
Mimi, I've asked all of our guests who are Plenary Council members thus far how you're feeling, whether there's hope and optimism. We're now over halfway through this process. How is it for you?
Yeah, look, from the outset, I was super excited about this Plenary Council. I'm happy that it's happening after 8 years. I'm happy that lay people are involved. I'm happy that women are involved. So sort of the first couple of days were really, really exciting, and I was glad to be there and be involved in the conversations. Yesterday was a little bit more difficult. I just felt as though there were diverging points of view, and it's always difficult when there are such controversial issues and people coming from different experiences and places of pain to find a common ground. And a dear priest friend of mine actually reminded me that there are going to be good days and bad days in this conversation. And I think yesterday was perhaps a bad day. I did feel a little bit confronted by some of the opinions and wondering how we're going to come to some sort of reconciliation. But then again, I think there has to be hope, and I do think that the intentions are good. There's openness, there's willingness to move forward and to get some clear outcomes from it. So I'm still hopeful.
John Warhurst said in his blog that he's trying to sort of hold lightly in his mind the idea that through what can sometimes seem a tortuous path, clarity emerges in ways that are not apparent to us when we're on the path. And I think that's what you're holding on to too. Thank you so much, Nimmi. It's been terrific to have you as our guest. Let's move now to our panel. This evening, my guests are Fatima Meashan, who's a Filipino Catholic writer based in Warrawurrung country. She was formerly a consulting editor, columnist and podcast producer for Eureka Street. Frank Brennan is with us too, a Jesuit priest and rector of Newman College at the University of Melbourne. He is emeritus at the Plenary Council and has published widely on Indigenous rights and the rights of asylum seekers and refugees, and he is doubly vaccinated. Welcome to you both. Frank, I'm going to go to you first on a powerful call by two of our Canberra-Goulburn Plenary Council members, John Warhurst and Francis Sullivan, and that is for the Australian Church to adopt the Uluru Statement from the Heart, for dioceses to embark on reconciliation action plans. Now, this is core business for some parts of the church. For others, it's an issue that's simply not the church's business, politicised perhaps. How do you respond?
I respond by saying that what we have in the Uluru Statement from the Heart is a clear statement by a significant group of Indigenous leaders in Australia They've said they want substantive constitutional change and they want a voice enshrined in the Constitution. I'm enough of a constitutional lawyer to know that you only change the Constitution by having everyone aboard, and you only do that if, in relation to Indigenous Australians, if you go forward with a proposal that the Indigenous leadership is seeking, and it's something which can be owned and put forward by both the Liberal and National parties and the Labor Party. Now, at the moment, the Labor Party is on board with what the Indigenous leadership's put forward. Liberal and Nationals aren't. So I think what's a responsibility of all of us who are committed to these issues, whether we're church or not, is to see what we can do in order to create that space where what Indigenous leaders are seeking can be found to resonate, particularly within the ranks of the Liberal and National parties. That takes a lot of politics, but it also takes a lot of public education and development of sympathy. Because one good thing in a democracy is, even on the conservative side of politics, politicians will follow if the public say this is what we want. So we still have a lot of work to do in order to get anywhere with this. But what we have is a clear statement from the Indigenous leadership what they want, and we as church should follow them.
A beautifully clear statement. I often think perhaps we should look at this as Americans look at the Gettysburg Address, something that is foundational and profound for our nation as a whole.
Well, and if I could add one other thing to this as a church type audience, one thing I think often overlooked in the Uluru Statement, the third paragraph of it is in italics, and it's about the spiritual notion of the relationship to land. And it's a direct quote from a judgment of the International Court of Justice by a Muslim judge from Lebanon. And what you have is a statement which is grounded in ancient philosophy and something which is a very spiritual statement, and we should appropriate more of that to ourselves.
Fatima, to you on the role of the church in a contemporary setting, I know that you think current structures can undermine the church's credibility. They stifle resonance of the faith, they impede institutional responses to socio-ecological crises. How so? And are you also assuming that the church needs to speak with one voice on major issues?
Well, I suppose we need to break that down in terms of whose voices we're talking about. Because the theme for tonight, the topic is church in the church in the public sphere. So what do you mean when we say church? Because normally people associate that with the ordained, right? And I think in some ways, in many ways, the clericalism that we've called out is mimicked in the media and by the media, where people ordained, usually guys, sorry, Frank. So male ordained are taken to have special insight. So that ends up being reflected even in the coverage around church issues, where the people most likely to be asked for comment are, clergy. So in terms of, your question, it is really important to consider as well a couple of contexts in terms of the way the church operates, vocally in public. One is to consider that the worst has already happened. So the abuse, the violence against children and adults inside the church is the worst thing to happen to the church. So all the rest, whether we let women become permanent deacons, or whether we, restructure the parish or look at governance structures and turn it inside out, that's not the worst thing that's going to happen to the Catholic Church. The worst has already happened, and it's happened to really vulnerable people. So we need to reckon with that. I'm making an emphasis of that because it means that we have to tread softly, and I think generally the public impressions of the language that gets used by people that are seen to be representative of the Catholic Church, they're not those voices aren't seen to be loving or speaking in a compassionate or merciful way. So I think it's really important for the church to consider how to tread softly. And I think we can take a lot from Aboriginal modes of care in terms of treading softly and walking with people. And it also involves figuring out when is the time to listen. I mean, when is the time to be silent, I should say. When is the time to show restraint? And when is the time to be prophetic? And by prophetic, I mean to actually tell the truth, not sort of use controlling language around people's behaviors. So I think I might leave it at that for now, because I'm sure other people have something to add.
Well, Frank, I just want to probe with you a little bit more deeply this idea of when and how the church can speak, and perhaps, as Fatima's just suggesting, when it should listen. I'm also interested in the idea of when the moral voice overrides different political opinions. I mean, perhaps we might look at the asylum seeker and refugee question, for example. Is that sufficiently morally significant that it ought to outweigh differing political opinions among the faithful and the church's leadership?
I mean, absolutely. Like,
sorry, Fatima, if I can just go to Frank on that.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
I thought I heard. Sorry, I thought it was me.
That's okay.
Well, I think on all of these things now, particularly given the issues we were discussing today, the question is when the church speaks, who's listening? And it's not so much any longer a question of what's the church doing or saying, it's what's the church doing and how is the church structuring itself? So is the church itself seen to be just? Is the church itself seen to be welcoming of the stranger? That sort of thing. But having acknowledged that, in terms of these fundamental issues, yes, the church has a role to speak, if you like, the old idea of truth to power. And that has to be done, particularly in relation to matters of human dignity and injustice, which impact upon the powerless in society. So I think specifically for groups like asylum seekers, the voice of the church must be heard. But it'll always be in a political context. And I've often found, I mean, for example, someone like myself, with the role I might play publicly, there'll be those on the left of politics who'll be very happy when I put my head up and say something about refugees or Aboriginal rights or whatever. But if it's on the topic of voluntary assisted dying or something like that, it's what does the bloody church think they're doing, getting their nose into our affairs? Well, no, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. If you're dealing with questions of fundamental human dignity and institutional injustice, then hopefully the voice of the church can always be heard. And yes, there'll be political differences within the church, but there has to be an acknowledgement that church teaching can resonate with principles and ways forward, which might be triumphed by one side of politics and not by the other.
And of course, Frank, you have long held the honourable and honorary title of Australia's Chief Meddling Priest.
Yes. Although I did prefer Kevin Rudd's title. Keating called me the meddling priest, but it was Rudd who said that I was an ethical burr in the nation's saddle. And I think that's probably a more appropriate image.
Oh, that's terrific. Fatima, we have been speaking about governance throughout these conversations, and this stymieing fact ultimately that the ordained hold all final decision-making powers in the church, no matter what principles of synodality and subsidiarity we apply. How does that apply to how the church responds to issues in the public sphere? How does the way we run the church apply to how we speak in matters of public conscience?
I think the first thing that came to mind is just the manner in which, the bishops make statements. I think in terms of the church having a voice in the public sphere, we can't do it by sending out media releases. Like there are other ways of, there are other ways for prosecuting, not prosecuting, but upholding certain values, reiterating, social justice understandings, other than just sending out a media release. In terms of governance structures, I would like, I suppose, to I mean, maybe that's something that's worth exploring, whether there is a more agile way for the episcopacy and Catholic agencies and organizations to be able to speak on public issues, drawing from expertise, including science, drawing from, you know, the sense of the faithful as well, and basically, just being able to do that in a more agile, but also like rigorous way, rather than having an assortment of bishops put out statements and releasing them to the press, and then like that's it. You know, in terms of how we, I suppose, project ourselves in the public. I mean, you know, I'm from the Philippines, so in terms of, you know, I think we talked last night about these status signifiers, you know, people calling clergy father, and, you know, the clerical collar and the habit and all that sort of stuff. But my formative experiences in terms of what I saw was nuns and sisters in solidarity with workers during the Marcos era, and basically putting themselves on the line. I know that clergy were at Standing Rock in the United States, trying to, you know, put their moral, you know, force and behind aspirations, Native American aspirations. So there's any number of examples. I think of, you know, Elizabeth Young, who got arrested, you know, after a sit-in with the Love Makes a Way group for, you know, to advocate for asylum seekers. So in terms of how we speak, it's not just what we say, but what we don't say, and I suppose how we manifest other than just words, and using those signifiers of status to actually to actually speak for the poor and those who are marginalized. I mean, we talk about building, we talk about the credibility of the church, but why? Like, what are we building credibility for? And I think for me, it's in service of those who find it difficult to make themselves heard. So I think for me, that's part of the function. It's not so much that we have to say something or we should say something, but it's like, who are we enabling to speak? How are we, what you know, the question perhaps is whether or not we are making room, as Frank was saying, providing space for people to be able to express their aspirations and put our own, put our own support behind it.
Two more quick questions. One for you, Frank. Vaccination, huge pressing issue. Is there a public-facing role for the church here?
Is it a?
Vaccination. Is there genuinely a public-facing role for the church here?
Well, I mean, the role of the church, I think, as with any group committed to the public good and the common interest, is to say that the sooner you all get vaccinated, the better. Now, there may be some who, for health reasons, can't. Well, that's accepted. There may be some who have religious objections. If they do, we'll work that out. But as I said to someone the other day who told me they had religious objections, I said, look, this isn't just the equivalent of not wearing a seatbelt. This is the equivalent of driving on the wrong side of the road. Now, you can only drive on the wrong side of the road if you're sure that there's going to be no one else on the road. Now, if you're not going to get yourself vaccinated, then just out of common decency, at least until we've got herd immunity, you've got to separate yourself out from the rest of the community. So basically, the message is very simple. Go and get vaccinated and do it as quickly as possible.
Fatima, last quick question to you. The Plenary Council began with the question, what do you think God is asking of us in Australia at this time? We've been talking about a number of pressing contemporary moral issues and how the church responds in the public sphere. What sort of question do you think we need to end with?
Well, that's like, you have me stumped there. How, like, what question should the First Assembly finish with?
Yeah.
I think that it's really about how we are to respond to God from now on, because I think it's been really clear. We have 17,000 submissions. We had Light from the Southern Cross report. We have Men and Women report. We've got this plenary process ongoing. And I think there are certain things that are bubbling up that seem very, very clear that are telling us, like God's already talking to us. So I think the next question would be, well, how are you going to respond then to that call?
Okay, terrific to have you both with us. Thank you so much for your insights tonight. And I'm going to move now to questions from our audience via our moderator. Danielle Lynch is with us again. She's a teacher and musician, head of religion in a Catholic secondary school and a sessional lecturer in theology at the Australian Catholic University. Off you go, Danielle. What do people want to know?
A fascinating conversation, which has provoked a lot of really interesting questions, which I hope we can get many of them tonight, but not all perhaps. So I come to you from the lands of the Gubbi Gubbi people. Nimmi, I'll take you back firstly to a comment you made about the genius of women, John Paul II. Some questions around the place of women and what their role is in the church. We know obviously Australian Women Preach is a podcast showing women are more than capable of breaking open the gospel. Women have skills and experience in many other areas that would contribute towards governance. Is the idea of genius of women a way of othering women?
Yeah, look, I think that's a fair point as well. I think I don't like that notion that we are somehow the parts that the men aren't. You know, it's almost like we are we're not people for our own rights. We're more about what can we contribute where men can't contribute. I think for me, it's just really important to be able to say, this is half of God's creation. Let's just allow women to be part of it. I think one of my hopes, a broad hope for the Plenary Council outcome, is that we might be able to free ourselves a little bit from being told how to live out our faith and allowing ourselves to express our faith in different ways. And there are many women out there who I think are quite hurt and restricted by a sense of not having a platform, if you like, to share their faith in. And I think that's just important. I think, you know, priesthood and ordination, that's another question altogether, but there's a possibility of just forming a formal role for women in some way where we can say, okay, let's just draw, if the hierarchical church genuinely believed that women had lots to offer, then we will find a way of incorporating our thoughts and our beliefs.
Absolutely, and we have to move past the complementarian understanding. All the knowledge we now have from gender studies shows that that's not something we can witness in this society. And we have comments in the chat saying things like, you know, preach the gospel always where necessary, use words. I'm sure there are women living out that every day. And if I can just ask you another question, as a member of the Plenary Council, someone is asking about the idea of the members and their connection to the parish and how well you feel the members represent the voices of those. Someone was saying they don't feel very well represented. They haven't had a lot of connection with the members from their area. They don't feel like their points are being expressed or they're not connecting with. What's your experience of connecting with your area and representing?
Look, we were told right from the start that we're not representatives of anyone. We were initially called delegates and the term changed to members because there was a sense of pressure that people were feeling, the members were feeling, that we had to represent people. This wasn't meant to be an election of some sort. It was a sense that people put their hands up in terms of indicating interest in being part of the Plenary Council. There was a vetting process of some sort, I guess. And then there was a selection. So I have, of course, spoken to different people. I'm interested in hearing what they have to say. I've read the submissions and summaries of the submissions. But I don't think people really feel as though this is what we're here for. We're here to hear the Spirit working in us and to find different ways of reflecting what we're hearing into the different conversations.
Great, thank you. I'm sure that gives a different understanding of what it means to be a member. And Fatima, if I can come across to you now, we had some conversation around the idea that the church is more than just parish. There are many different organizations working under the banner of what church is. And one of those is schools. And the question came from someone who feels like schools maybe have been a little bit neglected in the sense that Catholic education perhaps hasn't had the run that they would expect at this point. And schools really are the future generations of the church. Students are being formed in the Catholic faith. And the question, I suppose, is, do you have hope for that future, or is the church irrelevant to young people if it doesn't realize gender equality?
That's a really good point. Thanks for that question. It just reminds me, someone actually said that our Catholic schools are full, but our pews are empty. Like, how can that be? I have a son who's 13, and I'm really sad to say he is a bit detached. He's a bit disengaged. And I hear that a lot from young people. I was a teacher as well. They feel that the church is out of alignment with their own sense of fairness and justice. So this goes back again to credibility. So we can't, it's really, really difficult to evangelize. And by evangelize, I mean to preach the good news, not to shore up members. It's not I don't want to think, we really need to drop the idea of the Catholic Church as a club and worry about, we should, find strategies to somehow shore our numbers back up. The point is that young people need to be, love being inspired. They love latching on to, they love latching on to movements and projects that make them feel that their lives are meaningful. And especially during a pandemic, it can be quite difficult. It's really hard to see a future that's concrete for them. And I think that as far as discernment goes, and it's really, really important to take seriously what young people are saying about what they value. I mean, that's the same thing with Indigenous peoples or even women. We've been part of the crisis, by the way, has to do with the fact that we didn't take kids seriously. We didn't take young people seriously. And I think we need to sort of start practicing and getting into the mode of taking people seriously when they say something means something to them or matters to them. So I think as far as schools goes, the church, the schools, teachers have got their own, they got their own things to work out as well outside of the parish in terms of how to fulfill that mission in a really imaginative way that suits the times and is in alignment with where young people are at today, right now.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point, that when students raise questions with me about credibility issues, and I say to them, you are church. So if you are a credible witness, you are church and you are the witness. So go out and be the witness. So I think you're right there in that point you make. Frank, I wonder if I can come over to you now. A statement about the shortage of priests, and in fact, a comment that there is no shortage of priests. It is that the priesthood of all of the baptized is not recognized. That is an uncontroversial part of our Catholic Christian doctrine. So how can we embrace and celebrate the priesthood that exists within all of the believers?
Well, I think we do it as we're doing this week, that, 280 people have come together, members of this plenary assembly, and they own the show. We are the church, and we are a priestly people. But let's not get away from the really fundamental question, to my mind, is, yes, we're a priestly people, but I always think first and foremost, we're a Eucharistic people. And particularly in rural and regional Australia, it's been known for a long time, people have been denied the Eucharist. And that, I think, is the fundamental starting point for question. What do we need to do as the church community in order that the Eucharistic community can gather, and in order that the word can be broken open and that the bread can be shared? Now, out of that, I think, comes a bolder notion of priesthood, including the priesthood of all believers.
Oh, that's a very interesting reflection. And while we're talking, Frank, I wonder if you have any comments to make on the titles that we give to our priests, your eminence, your grace, your excellency. Has the time come that we get rid of these titles and we address people more informally and we recognize more of a level playing field?
I think so, although I think there is a place for formality in some circumstances. I mean, I'm a lawyer, and I think that, you know, when you have a situation of conflict in a courtroom, then showing due deference to a judge or whatever is important. I remember many years ago, 1991, the World Council of Churches Assembly was on, and there was a huge Barney going on, and I had the job as the sort of intermediary between the Indigenous groups and the international media. So we were waiting outside for 3 hours as they debated all these things. Sir Ronald Wilson came out at the end of the night, and I said to him, well, Ron, one advantage of being a Catholic would be this wouldn't have taken 3 hours. It would have been just, yes, my Lord, of course, Your Grace, absolutely, Your Eminence, and Your Holiness will do it immediately. So there are some benefits in hierarchy and due deference, but I think there's been too much of it in the Catholic Church.
Thank you, Frank. Fatima,
I'll
I'll
jump
come
in.
back. Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, because I don't think I've commented yet in terms of like gender equity. I mean, we've spoken like the idea of an integral ecology is one of the strains running through these discussions. And can I just point out then that in two things. One, in nature, diversity is actually encoded. That's what makes ecosystems resilient. So anytime you have a place that's turning into a monoculture or is being taken over by dominant invasive species, it tends to end up being a degraded environment. So we take our cue from nature, we take our cue from Indigenous engagement with nature, which respects diversity. Diversity is what makes any system resilient. And I think that's what has made the Catholic Church brittle. It hasn't been resilient. It hasn't been diverse as far as leadership goes. Secondly, it matters to have women on board because the crises that we are facing inside and outside the church are too great. Like, it's not just about gender equity for its own sake. It's purposeful. Like we're asking for it for a purpose. And I think that's worth sort of like really holding in hand.
A follow-up question on that then, Fatima, with the idea that if we take our cues from nature and we create that environment, the question is about the idea of transparency in the church and the idea that because it's become such a monolithic structure with its own principles guiding, it hasn't looked outwards, I suppose. What can we do about the processes that are not necessarily transparent, even when lay people are appointed into governance issues? How can we take cues from outside?
That's a really important point, and I'm sort of not really an expert on canon law or human resources or organizational psychology. But definitely, I suppose what I would say to that is that, I mean, and sometimes, you know, we make this distinction between our world and a secular world, as if the secular world is inferior and hostile, and, you know, we don't have anything to learn from that world. But there's no Catholic world and secular world. It's just the world. In my experience as a person who's occasionally public about being Catholic, people outside the Catholic Church have got higher expectations of us and our leaders than sometimes we do. Like, how can that be? Like, I think it's really, really important to learn, you know, from more, from what we might call secular, you know, structures, but then also not to sort of to some degree, avoid navel gazing too much about the Australian experience, because these issues have also been explored and examined in places like Latin America and the Philippines, and they've come up with like really novel solutions when they face these questions. So I think it's really important to be open about what might come out of this plenary process, even if you don't recognize it, even if it's not familiar.
Thanks, Fatima. And that answers a question that someone's raised about the artificial binary that we put up, or the artificial distinction between the church and the world, or the church and the state. And that actually doesn't really exist because we all operate in the same world. And Nimmi, if I can come back to you with one final question, very briefly, about the assembly today and what went on and the decision not to live stream. What are your reflections ultimately on that? Someone wants to know how you experienced that and what are your thoughts about the decision not to live stream?
Look, personally, I was glad for it. I think that it was a pretty intense time. And see, I think I've been conscious that while the public eye has been on the council, and there are so many expectations of the council from the public, the members within the council are also trying to do our best. And personally, someone like me doesn't operate that well when I'm being scrutinized. So I think just being able to be there, to feel as though I can feel what I'm feeling, I'm experiencing, and not worried about hiding my feelings, or not worried about being criticized for it, or, you know, I think it was so important for us as members to just feel it and to experience it, and not feel as though we had to justify our feelings.
Thank you, Nimmi. And I thank the panelists, and I echo the comments of someone who says how impressive are the people both attending this council, but also who have been a part of these conversations this week, especially the women, they say. So thank you so much, the panelists. Genevieve, I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Danielle. And thank you to all of our guests. It's been another rich and marvellous conversation. Tomorrow night, we'll be talking about the inclusion and exclusion of women in the church. And I would draw to your attention, Australian Women Preach. This has been a theme that has come through all of our discussions so far at the Plenary Council Tracker. And you might like to look out for their podcast, Raising the Voices of Australian Women Preaching the Gospel. We'll be joined tomorrow night by Plenary Council member Virginia Burke and by Andrea Dean and Pip McElroy. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow at 7:30.